All right, hey guys, we're doing something new on the Noetic podcast. Today, what we're going to do is start developing this stable of Kierkegaardian scholars to talk about their particular form of research and sort of to expose the wider listening public to the work of Soren Kierkegaard. As many of you know, that's my area of specialties. And I guess I want to introduce you to my friend Matt. Matt and I met when we were in residence Kierkegaard scholars at St. Olaf. Is that how we met, or did we meet?
I'm not sure if
Or was it through Coursera when we were teaching for Coursera? How did we meet?
I think it might have been one of the conferences during the year of Kierkegaard birth celebrations or whatever. Because there was Baylor.
Oh, yeah.
I might not have met till Baylor.
Okay. But I feel like our paths have crossed in many
Yeah.
ways. All right, so it's kind of double helical in structure here.
Yeah.
So maybe before we sort of get into the marrow of your research, maybe give a little bit of a background. Who are you? What entitles you to speak with any sort of authority about Kierkegaard? And by the way, I want everybody to know I do think you are an authority on Kierkegaard. So maybe just say a little bit about your educational background and what drew you to this thinker, this luminous thinker, and what really fascinates you about Soren Kierkegaard. Maybe talk a little, and as you do those things, we can start getting into the arc of your research project.
So my first introduction to Kierkegaard was in a high school church youth group where I was trying to figure out if there were any Christian philosophers, because when you're raised in kind of some rural church settings, you kind of think that academy bad, Bible good, and it's drawn in a really strict dichotomy. And so someone mentioned Kierkegaard. I still didn't read him. But then when I got into Bible college and was doing a biblical studies undergrad.
And where were you again?
Elam Bible Institute,
Okay.
a small non-accredited Bible college upstate. And during one of the courses we took, we watched some videos and got some lectures about Kierkegaard from a person who really misunderstands Kierkegaard. A famous Christian apologist.
Well, it's easy to misunderstand. We should state that at the outset that maybe it wasn't your professor's fault for misinterpreting Kierkegaard because he wanted to sow confusion.
I'm not going to say it was the professor who misunderstood so much as the apologist whose materials we were using who misunderstood Kierkegaard.
I see.
And there's actually an article about this very same apologist named Francis Schaeffer, who's a famous Christian apologist, started a place called L'Abri in, I think, Switzerland, I want to say.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah. So there's an excellent in the Kierkegaard Research 21-volume series that John Stewart put out through the Kierkegaard Research Center. There's an article in one of them called Francis Schaeffer, How Not to Read Kierkegaard by Kyle Roberts.
I'm very interested. How did Francis Schaeffer interpret the Kierkegaardian project? I didn't even know that he was interested.
For Schaeffer, he sees existentialism as breaking down our ability to know things. So Schaeffer reads Kierkegaard through the lens of Bultmann and the separation of like the Christ of faith versus the Christ of history. And Schaeffer doesn't like this idea that we believe, but he doesn't like fideism, which is what he thinks Kierkegaard is.
Maybe you should explain that term for our non-initiated public.
Yeah. Fideism is when you, like, I might learn certain things about a topic, but and there might be two arguments about something. I might have a sense of faith in one argument over the other. Fideism would say you don't even consider evidence, you just believe for the sake of belief, and you don't need to think at all. You just choose to believe. In the face of contrary evidence, like even if you were proven wrong, you'd still believe it, because you have faith in faith for faith's sake.
Right. And this is, I think, a lot of people's interpretation of Kierkegaard because of the famous maxim that sort of gets magnified as this thinker becomes more mysterious, the quote-unquote leap of faith. And, that's super complex. But we're getting into, we're getting a little bit, we're off topic and on topic. So
it is important for my research.
Okay.
This ties in.
All right, then I'm going to let you proceed.
So I'm glad you brought up the leap of faith, because the way Schaeffer made me understand the leap of faith was that you come to this place of despair because you can't prove anything. And so what you do is you just take a leap and choose to believe in God and the absolute.
But that's not necessarily an entirely wrong interpretation of Kierkegaard, right? It's just that the way that Schaeffer has depicted is that it seems so arbitrary that it's just like that it would be like choosing to eat a banana for lunch rather than an apple, right? So the commitments that we make are so easily decided upon. Well, I can't prove anything. I might as well just go with the heritage that I was brought up with. So there's going to be a certain hue and rigor to Kierkegaardian commitments so that choice isn't so arbitrary, that it's a very difficult decision that transforms us.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a decision that's just made in your own headspace. And this goes into my own research of Kierkegaard, what was beneficial for me, I feel like, was when I read The Leap of Faith, and when I read some of the language Kierkegaard used to describe God and the God relationship, because my heritage religiously was Pentecostalism, which is a tradition that holds that we can experience God in the here and now. Mm-hmm. I read The Leap Pentecostally, and it got me thinking, like, maybe there's something mystical or spiritual or something.
I see where you're going.
Something more is happening here than just simply, well, life sucks, so I guess I should just believe.
Right.
And I didn't think that was necessarily the case. So that thought stayed in the back of my head for a few years until I got to the end of my master's program at Regent University.
You're really good at tying all this together.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're really good at this.
So I got to the end of my time at Regent University and was going to write my master's thesis. And I decided to write, it has a very original name. It's called Soren Kierkegaard and Pentecostalism, a Dialogue. And I wrote, I did a few things. I discovered that Kierkegaard's family was involved with the Moravian Brethren Church, and the Moravians were a sect of Lutheran pietism, so they emphasized personal religious devotion and piety, and they had their own sort of mystical, Pentecostal-y things happening, like very passionate spirituality, like that took on different forms, and especially the group Kierkegaard was involved in, which were the Herrnhuters, who were attached to a group that was led by Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf.
You're really getting into the weeds.
Whose community actually also ended up influencing John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. And then Methodism is a precursor to modern-day Pentecostalism. So it's yeah, it's been a nice little seamless sort of evolution. And this idea and topic has been with you since you were in high school. Yeah. So let's spell it out a little bit. Let's talk. So we've kind of wandered around what exactly animates you from a research perspective. So maybe let's explicate the specific problem that is exercising so much of your research. Sure. So at this point, it's a matter of trying to figure out, does the mystical, as I would understand it, maybe in a Pentecostal fashion or in some historical church type of way, does the mystical play a role in Kierkegaard? So the mystical, any unexplainable spiritual experience. It's passive, it's transitory. This is William James's thing. It's passive, it's transitory, it's ineffable, so you can't quite put it into words. And there's one more thing that it is, but I can't remember what it is. But it's this unexplainable yet very personal spiritual experience.
So you're asking if there's a role for that, and what's your instinct tell you when you started this endeavor? What did your instinct tell you? Because it's got to be sort of paradoxical, which is essential to what Kierkegaard does. Because there's reasons to think that there might be a large domain for the mystical in Kierkegaard, because so much of it is predicated on one's subjective relationship with Christ and actually being in contact with the Son of God, which you could argue is a mystical experience of some nature.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, Kierkegaard is not making recourse to miracles all over the place to substantiate a lot of what he's doing philosophically. So it's not really a big part of his authorship. Maybe you can expound upon that tension about why that is such a big problem to investigate the mystical within Kierkegaard. Because I don't know if I've done it justice, because you've thought about it a lot more than I have.
By the way, that fourth characteristic, noetic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Dope.
So you feel like after a mystical experience, you now know something.
I think we
even if
just
you
had a
can't
mystical
remember it.
experience.
It all came full circle.
I know why I met you at Baylor all those years ago. It was preordained.
Noetic.
Yeah. So
That's if you think God knows the future. But anyway, keep going. We don't have to get into
mean by
that.
no?
We don't have to get
What
into
is-
We don't have to get into that. It's not important. It's not important.
so I've sort of illustrated what I interpret to be the problem, to be why there might be reasons for thinking that the mystical has a large role in Kierkegaard, and why there might be reasons to think that the mystical doesn't have much of a role in Kierkegaard. Maybe elaborate on that, because I can't imagine that I'm expounding upon it enough to really grasp the seriousness of what you research.
So I'll do the reasons why it might be the case, and then I'll do the reasons against, and that will lead into
Sure.
how I'm dealing with certain text and things. Reasons to think it does play a role is because Kierkegaard arguably himself had a mystical experience in the lead up to his conversion back to his childhood Christianity. So a few things happened.
Ooh, can I hear about that? Is it off topic or?
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about this mystical experience.
So in the journals, in his journals, there's an entry from May 19th, 1838. And he describes this experience of joy that comes across as things like, you could use words like ineffable, noetic, transitory, or transient, like passing and passive. He's this recipient of joy. So you have this mystical experience, and then...
Did it just happen to him? Was he praying? Did he see a vision?
It's just this mention of joy. Walter Lowry, I think, is the one who used the term mystical to describe it, and others have used the term mystical to describe it as well.
Well, it seems like a kind of a low bar for the mystical, because in that way, then I would say I've had numerous encounters with the mystical in that way.
Sure.
Maybe not numerous, not so that it's like commonplace, but as a religious person, I think that I've had those moments of ineffable joy.
Sure, I think...
Yeah.
And for Kierkegaard at the time, he's coming back to a place where he's giving himself back over to his Christianity, which also culminates in, he reconciles with his father, and then his father dies, and around this time around the time of his mystical experience, he's writing a critique of Hans Christian Andersen, famous Danish novelist. He's critiquing Only a Fiddler, which you find in the early polemical writings if you read the Hong translations from Princeton University.
Man, you're in
Press.
deep. Look at you.
And I've written actually on whether that, because he met Anderson on the street before he wrote this review and said, "Oh, I'll give you a review. It should be good."
Yeah.
And then if you look at it, like, he has this mystical conversion. Maybe this conversion encouraged him to carry through on that critique of Anderson. Maybe it plays into his idea that we need a life view and an ethical identity to ground ourselves versus just being scatterbrained and living for pleasure, living in despair, and which also plays into my research in the mystical. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, sure. So we have some. One of the reasons for thinking that Kierkegaard was pro-mystical experience was that he had one himself, or is documented in some ways in journals. What are some other reasons to think that he may have been in favor of mystical experiences?
If you read his take on groups like the Pietists, the Herrnhuters, even Methodism, like, he appreciates their form of spirituality, even though he thinks there are some. He does criticize them. He's not without criticism, but there are things about them that he likes. He's influenced by a number of Catholic mystics, Thomas of Kempis, Tauler, and others. And then, of course, when you read this emphasis on subjectivity and the God relationship, even stuff with Abraham, Abraham hears a voice.
Yeah.
And that's how
he would be a schizophrenic in our society.
Yeah. Abraham hears this voice, and he transcends the socially accepted ethical and does this other thing.
Right, which is found in a text called Fear and Trembling.
Yeah.
That's a question I want to ask you a little bit down the line, because I haven't powwowed with other Kierkegaardian scholars on this issue, but specifically where to recommend an entry point for people who want to discover Kierkegaard. But that diverts our attention from the main question that we're talking about here, which is reasons for and against the mystical in Kierkegaard. So keep going. Yes.
So against, so the influence of the mystics and some people who are, so the influences are there. They're just not brought out. And maybe some have said maybe Kierkegaard doesn't talk about it as explicitly because the mystical is something sacred to him, therefore he doesn't want to dirty it by bringing it into the light for dissection or something. Against it would be you have someone like Alistair Hannay in his Kierkegaard biography saying that experience of joy was just a passing mood and was no. When I read it, he made it sound like it was no big deal.
It could have just been something that originated from his own psychology, a sad experience of some sort. A blip in the brain, right?
Yeah. A blip in the brain, yeah. Maybe some sort of, I mean, it could have been psychosis.
A hallucination, or something of that nature.
And then you have, I forget, this might be Peter Saja. Peter Saja, in a issue of the Kierkegaard Studies Yearbook, which is online. Well, you can get it online as a publication, but he says that I brought up the issue of the mystical influences, but he argues that maybe what influenced Kierkegaard most about the mystics wasn't their mysticism, but other things they said. And I can't remember if it's him or not who says that the experience of joy in the journals that I mentioned was just simply joy about reconciling with his father, potentially. I think that might be right, because to me, I read certain similarities, for instance, between the book on Adler.
Which is the proper title of it is Authority and Revelation. Is that the name of the text? I actually just got a copy of it. I have to confess I haven't read the entire authorship because I've been so focused on the texts that are relevant to my dissertation. But I've been trying to make a habit of it in the new year to read the ones that I haven't read. So I'm about halfway through the book on Adler, and I don't know. I was going to say, how does I really can't speak to it with any authority, but I was going to say, how does that? It would seem like that text would directly speak to what you're talking about, and maybe we should give some background to the Adler situation.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm very curious how this particular text of Kierkegaard fits in with the Kierkegaardian project writ large and your research, because I could see it really informing it. Or am I misinformed?
No,
am I totally off topic?
It's one of my two primary texts.
Okay. So maybe give some historical context for the book and the problems that Kierkegaard tried to address that. And maybe what are some of the conclusions that came out of that text? Because Kierkegaard's presented with a really unique dilemma in that book, is he not?
Yeah, so there's a pastor named Adler who claims that he receives a new doctrine from God. Basically something like man would not have sinned if they had had knowledge. I forget, I don't have the text in front of me. But he receives this new revelation from God. He hears this voice. He receives this doctrine.
Was it kind of like a Joseph Smith kind of situation?
Sounds a little like it.
Was it like, were there commands and tablets and
there were no
tablets and stuff? Or was it just like
this
one...
It's like this paragraph of information.
That's all it is?
Yeah.
And so he had this... God spoke to him, gave him this paragraph of information, something about how knowledge and sin...
Yeah.
Knowledge would have defeated sin had man had it, or something to that effect.
Some probably Hegelian thing or something.
Okay.
Right? So he throws out some of his Hegelian manuscripts, if memory serves right. But the problem is his supervisors start coming down on him, and then he starts saying things like, well, he never recants, but he says, well, it was actually just an emotional experience, or it was actually
I was inspired, maybe.
So he uses Kierkegaard's biggest problem with Adler is that, like, no, if you say you heard from God, then you stick with it, even if you...
Well, why does Kierkegaard have to affirm that? Because, the reason why, what I'm getting at here is that Kierkegaard has had to affirm that in the case of Abraham, right? In Fearing Eternally. If Kierkegaard is going to marshal Abraham as a legitimate sort of prophet of God that was able to have this direct communication of God.
I hadn't thought of that. That's great.
I guess for the sake of consistency, he has to at least entertain the notion that Adler may be able to do it as well. Now it seems like a crazy idea because we typically think of those miraculous sort of interventions and those revelations and things like that being confined to the Bible alone. And when the Bible is done, like nothing else happens.
Well, that's because we're too Protestant. But
it seems very strange. Like we would think that if we are in this sort of ongoing, developing relationship with God, that the miracles and the revelation shouldn't stop. And maybe they never do. Maybe it just takes like people like Adler to speak up and say something. I know I'm talking crazy talk right here, but I mean, for the sake of consistency, how do Christians get away with acknowledging so much that defies science, reason, expectations, whatever else, and then get to be so sober in regards to, oh, well, no, that's not Jesus in your toast. Jesus isn't talking to you through your toast. Like how do we develop that litmus test, you know? And how do we automatically deem someone like Adler to be a crazy person? Like, why should we?
Well, Kierkegaard pleads the fifth on Adler.
Does he? Is that his ultimate conclusion?
There's a sense of pleading the fifth, like where he never explicitly says that you can't get a revelation like that. He never says it. What he does say is like, but he should be consistent. Like, he either needs to say yes, you either need to say yes, I heard from God this way, or you need to recant if you're going to change your mind later and change your story.
I wonder if it's possible to be mistaken about a direct interaction with God. I don't know if we can be. I don't know if it can be like, maybe I'm delusional. I don't know. Too much silence to think that one over. I don't know. I don't know if I could. If God really spoke to you, you would know it, right?
Maybe. I mean, it's almost like I like the way the movie Noah shows Noah hearing from God, because it's in this. It's like this message comes across, and I think sometimes the prophets were probably spoken to, like
or Exodus. Have you seen the movie Exodus? The similar sort of Bible history or whatever, like that. I believe a child, or maybe it was Noah. There was like a child that's speaking to. So Moses is getting all these messages from God, but it's coming through this vessel. There's this child that sort of follows him around or whatever. It's some really dramatic. A lot of people don't like those movies because they take so much. So many. I love them. I think they're really dope. So all right. So Kierkegaard pleads the fifth on Adler. All right, whether or not he could receive direct revelation and all of that. So what does that mean for your research? If Kierkegaard has to say, I'm going to recuse myself from this investigation, or I can't make heads or tails of it, or whatever. So how does that inform what you do? And if it's ultimately a dead end, what's the other text that you're drawing from that does inform how you make heads or tails of certain mystical experiences?
So the criticism of Adler is the same one he makes against Hans Christian Andersen. That you have this stuff you're writing, you're speaking, or whatever, but you're not writing with a life view. Like, there's no like sense of wholeness to your life that gives your life a direction. You're all over the place. You're confused. You're just sort of following your immediacy, and you're in despair. You're an aesthetic, as it were. Like, you're just living for your immediacy, and you have no foundation. Like
So he didn't think Adler was an authentic religious being. He didn't think Adler had gone through those revolutions of self to get out of the muck of immediacy and despair.
That's hard because the spheres overlap.
Yeah.
So it's
hard for others to judge.
But he does call him. There's a premise author and then an essential author. An essential author has a life view. A premise author doesn't, and just throws out something, and then it's just confused and all over the place.
Yeah.
And so Adler's a premise author, as would be. I really hope I'm not confusing those. If you read it and the essential author is the one that Adler is, just reverse this. It's fine. But Andersen is the same. He's a premise author. And so within Adler's mystical experience and within Hans Christian Andersen's aesthetic writing, there's this sense of like the critique of both is that both need a life view to ground themselves. And I think Kierkegaard even says that spiritual emotions are fine. This is an Adler. These spiritual emotions are fine if they're grounded in Christian concepts. Or in other words, if there is a life view, if there's a direction for them, if there's something that grounds them beyond just the immediacy.
So let me get this straight, and I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just trying to get my head around it. That the mystical experience is less legitimate if the person is less formed from an existential point of view. If the person is more developed from the existential point of view, and that's a massive topic, or what it means of development, the more legitimate the mystical experience is. I guess what I'm trying to understand here is, can God have mystical experiences with aesthetics? Or can he only have mystical experiences with fully formed religious people, whatever that means?
I don't think it delegitimizes the mystical experience at all. But I think, like, even with the religious, it's the ethico-religious. It's not just the religious sphere. Like, ethics are a part of the religious. And so in the same way, like, aesthetics aren't bad. And this is either or. Part 2 is the other text I'm drawing on heavily. This idea that the aesthetics are fine. First love is fine. And then it gets renewed again through the ethical,
Right.
the image of marriage, that marriage revitalizes first love over and over again.
Sure.
The aesthetic is drawn into the ethical. And so it's not that aesthetics are bad. Aesthetics are great.
Well, I guess what I had in mind is when I was thinking about someone who sort of remains a sort of aesthetic life, the person that's seeing Jesus in their toast is not to be taken as seriously as someone who's more fully evolved in their existential development. I'm not making the claim here that aesthetics or ethics or anything, and we're really getting into like some minutia of the Kierkegaardian project. But what I'm wondering here is, depending what stage one finds themselves in, because I don't think, although Kierkegaard would say that the spheres sort of bleed into one another, he would also say that certain individuals remain mired in certain spheres until they make certain sort of commitments that evolve them out of them, right? So you don't really enter into ethical existence until you sort of take responsibility for your life. You don't really enter into religious existence until you have a certain sort of relationship with God, and so on and so on.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm saying is the boundaries are blurry if you've made a bunch of commitments, and then you can kind of shrink and expand, but they're pretty well defined, it seems to me. If you haven't made the commitments, like you're kind of cordoned off from those sort of dimensions, it seems.
Well, and again, the issue is I want to stay away from the issue of legitimizing, delegitimizing mystical experiences.
Okay.
Because that's not the language I'm using.
Okay, I'm getting hung up on it a little bit.
So I don't want to get into discussions about figuring out the difference between Toast and Abraham.
Yeah.
Just that the potential exists and the avenue becomes open. And this is the end goal of my research, is to say, in the same way that the aesthetic can be transfigured by the ethical, the mystical can be transfigured by the ethical.
Okay. So, yeah. So, I have a lot of questions about that. And I'll table the other one, because I was going to ask what other text you were drawing on.
Either or part two.
Either or part two. Okay, I missed that. Sorry.
Which has its own interesting things
Right.
about mysticism, too.
So what I'm kind of curious about, so when I think about the aesthetic being transformed by the ethical, like I think about, say, friendship, right? Like had we known each other as kids, right, we would have existed in sort of a aesthetic sort of friendship. We would have been defined by our proximity to one another, the fact that we both liked playing Super Mario Brothers, and we went to the same kindergarten or something like that, right? And then as we got older, we realized we didn't really have that much in common, so we drifted away. Or as we got older, we realized what was sort of good and true about that relationship, and we make commitments to one another to preserve what was so wonderful about that blossoming friendship when we were children. So we sort of enact the ethical to redeem the aesthetic nature of our friendship, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be an example to me of how the aesthetic is redeemed by ethical commitment. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how the mystical gets redeemed by the ethical. Maybe I shouldn't say redeemed, gets transformed, ushered into the ethical.
Sure.
So it doesn't seem as obvious to me how that works. So maybe describe the mechanics of how you see it working.
So there are. So Kierkegaard gives these are Judge William, mm-hmm. the pseudonym of either or two, but for our purposes, Kierkegaard, because they're kind of alike, except Kierkegaard's not married and the Judge is, but one of the things that Kierkegaard. Okay, we're just going to call him Kierkegaard.
Yeah. Well, we should say something about the way that Kierkegaard writes, is that he employs an army of pseudonyms to give these perspectives on the existential development of the individual. And especially when we're concerning ourselves with the first authorship works like either or, he's going to take on personas that represent ethical points of view, religious points of view, aesthetic points of view, and Judge Wilhelm is one of the ethical points of view. But it's Kierkegaard all along, except he remains sort of faintly committed to a lot of the things that he says. All right, so we're just going to talk about it as Kierkegaard, because I think it'd be too confusing. It'd be like, why is he talking about 30 people?
And which ethical? Is it a Kantian ethical? Is it a Fichtean ethical? Is it a Hegelian ethical? Who are those people? No, we'll avoid all that. But he criticizes the mystical person for getting so caught up in the mystical experience that they just want to stay there. And then later on, he talks about a similar experience someone has where maybe during a religious service, they feel this sense of God and they feel close. But then he says, but then you come back into your life. You commit yourselves to your relationships, to your job, to the world you're living in. And I think that's where the mystical gets transfigured. it goes from the thing of like, because you can have a mystical and then just sit around waiting for the next mystical experience, waiting for the next mystical experience. And I could think of certain places and people who I think like, who think this way. And like, because I have a Pentecostal background, I feel like I've seen this happen. I feel like I've done this. Where I've waited for the next experience and the next experience, and you don't really commit to living concretely where you're at. So I think to be transfigured for the mystical to be transfigured requires that, to take the experience for what it is, but then to take all that passion, all that stuff that happens there, and then to bring it into your concrete life, which you commit to with or without the mystical experience.
So what I'm curious about here is if you make a distinction, and I pointed this out earlier about why I thought there was reason to think that Kierkegaard would endorse mystical experiences, because at the end game of the Kierkegaardian project is ultimately to have contact with God through that is non-demonstrable in an objective way, that's radically individuated. And that's kind of it seems to be one of the traits of something that's mystical. It's like, it's just something that appears to you. It can't be affirmed really by anyone else. So what I'm kind of curious about, and I have that, I like to think that I have that relationship, and I can think about how that informs the way that I go about treating people and acting in the world, and what I see as my calling. I'm curious if it's different with these other types of mystical experiences. I guess what I'm curious, in your research, are you looking at a host of mystical experiences, or just how that mechanism may work? And what and I guess, can you rank them? Are there what are there species of mystical experiences from what you've looked into? And I know I'm probably not talking about it right, but I'm dead serious. I mean,
Sure.
I think we can talk about this.
In terms of, I mean, I don't have like a ranking system. The problem with mysticism...
You might be able to.
Well, the problem with mysticism is that there are... Number one, it's an open concept that you almost have to kind of like choose the construct of mysticism, or the construct through which you view mysticism. So are you talking about, a perennial mysticism that's like the mysticism is the same all over, and then the beliefs are just the trappings on it, but the real thing is the experience itself? Is it contextual, where that experience is just produced by a context? And then is it just constructed by the context, or is it genuine, but it's a contextual thing? Like a Buddhist experience is a Buddhist experience, a Buddhist mystical experience. A Christian mystical experience is a Christian mystical experience. Is it contextual in that sense? Is it purely constructed, or is there something there?
So let me get do you think Kierkegaard would allow for mystical experiences outside of Christianity?
He would, but
that would be one of the things. Like, so that would be one of my ways to get my mind, because I don't know if I understand when you say context this or that or whatever. I'm kind of searching for something a little bit more concrete. So, are there Buddhist mystical experiences on Kierkegaard's view?
Yes. I mean,
maybe can we talk about their subjective dimension at all, or do we just have to admit that they exist, like, and how they may differ from the Christian mystical experiences?
Well, there's the way Kierkegaard talks about it, and again, it's almost like with mysticism, you have to kind of pick your poison when you talk about it. You have to use your own constructs to get through it, and there are some different works comparing like Buddhist mysticism to Kierkegaard's writings, and I think Jack Mulder has written something on this. But Kierkegaard addresses the issue of what would be kind of referred to as, I mean, I hate using the term Oriental, but that's how he would have kind of understood it.
I think our listeners are charitable enough to understand the historical context of these thinkers.
This sort of Eastern, I mean, we could roughly call it Buddhist or Hindu, or some sort of like pantheistic, everything is God, all is one, like,
right.
And that the mystical experience is that sense of losing your individuality and becoming the one. And the judge actually refers to, in Either or Two, someone called Little Ludwig, who kills himself because it's almost, I mean, I don't know if you've talked about Schopenhauer on here before.
Not on the podcast, no.
But there's something very Schopenhauerian.
And Nietzschean, and I mean, at least in Birth of Tragedy, which I'm working on right now, he would call this sort of feeling sort of, fusing with the primordial being, the Dionysian, the he calls it the Buddhistic culture.
Yeah. I mean, so in that sense,
So it's not that. So when we talk about Buddhist mystical experience for Kierkegaard, it's not going to be that strange. Even people in a Western context who may not be religious at all can sort of get their heads around this. I mean, whether or not you believe in God or a particular type of God or whatever, I think everybody can sort of get their mind around this idea of being sublimated into something much bigger. Now, people may call it like feeling at one with the universe. Or they may describe it. They may have their own sort of terminology, which you point out the difficulties of talking about mystical experiences. I don't think that should be too problematic to talk about that as a mystical experience.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I don't really think that's inscrutable at all. I think if you were really to ask people honestly, I think there'd be something almost universal to that, which raises an interesting question about the particularity of mysticism, if it's something so widely experienced in so many walks of life. And
well, this is the contextualist perennialist conversation. The perennialists say mysticism is generally the same across the board. There's the mystical. I mean, that could be a very oversimplification, but that it's still different than the contextualist who's like, no, there's not some like based 0 point mysticism. This mysticism is Christian mysticism. This mysticism is Buddhist. Like, it's a Buddhist experience.
I see.
And then, like, this is Buddhist mysticism. This is Christian mysticism. Because this mystical experience was produced by a Christian context. This experience was produced by a Buddhist context.
Well, so it seems like to me that access to the sort of Buddhistic mysticism might be much larger than what we would call Christian mysticism. I'm seeing at least 3 forms of potential mysticism here. Okay, so go with me on this, and there are probably many, many more. But I'm saying sort of universal Buddhistic sort of thing that's sort of like a part of being a human and sort of having this sense of the divine or beauty or universal or justice or whatever we want to call it. We'll let people call God whatever they want to call it. And then there may be particular revelations within sort of the Christian tradition, like I mean it's much more prominent in Catholicism or whatever, like the Fatima prophecies or something like that. And then there's a radically subjective contact with God that Kierkegaard emphasizes within the Lutheran and Protestant tradition. I'm okay with calling those mystical. Am I wrong?
No, I get it.
At least 3 forms, and could we say that they're all very different, right?
I'm not cutting off the potential or saying that Kierkegaard doesn't. Did I correct me if I said that? I don't think I said this. That Kierkegaard would say those experiences aren't mystical, or that those experiences aren't mystical, but that when it comes to categorizing all this stuff, the categories are multiple. Even the
So Kierkegaard would acknowledge the diversity of mystical experiences.
Well, yeah, and he particularly, but when he talks about it, he uses the Buddhistic, like in either or where he talks about it one of the most explicit places, he mainly refers to it. It becomes a discussion about Eastern Buddhist mysticism, which he sees as kind of like this is going to be Nietzschean language, but not affirming the world and the concrete world you live in, and because like you get so lost in the world, this mystical experience, this sense of unity with the divine, that living in the world now isn't fun anymore, and so you eventually you end it.
Yeah, and this would be his night of infinite resignation. It sounds like
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah,
and so that's little Ludwig. He embraces this Eastern form of mysticism, and he ends up, which I think Abraham Kahn, I think, is the scholar who points out though that if that was Kierkegaard's understanding of Eastern mysticism and of Eastern religion and of all these things, then he misunderstood it. So there's also the issue of whether Kierkegaard understood those things, but as he articulates it, his problem with mysticism is that it keeps one from affirming the world that you live in, because you not only are you just living from experience to experience, but in little Ludwig's case, you despair of the world because you just want that experience, and you've seen that this world, it doesn't have much to offer anymore.
Well, so we're running up against 40 minutes here, and I usually try to keep these pretty digestible. I want you to know that you have an invitation to do this whenever, because I want to. So maybe if you want to, we can do this in a set of series. I want to tie this up a little bit,
okay?
Because we have a Super Bowl to watch, my friend.
Yeah. Go Broncos.
I wonder if the NFL is going to make me pay for that. I wonder if I'm allowed to wear this logo.
Well, Go Broncos, or whatever racist local team exists nearby.
Stop. So, what I want to say here is there a closing thought about your project, and then I want to ask the question that sort of emerged, and I want to ask this on camera because I think a lot of people would really benefit from this. So, is there one thing that you want to say that we may have left unresolved very quickly about our conversation so far, so it's not so unnatural that I interrupted you?
No. For me, my desire to study mysticism is in part my belief that that there is, what Rudolf Otto would call the numinous. There's the potential that there is a realm that exists outside of our reason and our experience, or our reason and our sense experience, and so maybe there is an encounter with something other than ourselves to encounter, which I would say is the Trinitarian God of Christianity and of Scripture, and would be Jesus and the Holy Spirit.
Well, we can get into that more in a future installment.
So like I would say that, and I want to be, but my whole thing is like, if I'm wrong, my guess is though if you head that way and you try to seek and find, you might find something you weren't expecting to find. And so for me, mysticism, and in Kierkegaard studies in particular, pushing the conversation in that direction, because it's like, no, there might actually be a God here who's worth talking about. Like some idea that's beyond just some like idea we've, evolved past or something. Like maybe there's like some actual there. And so that's my...
I can sense some Heidegger spilling into this too. In your conversation,
I have studied. There's been some phenomenology, but Heidegger might say that that's just ontotheology and dismiss the whole thing. So,
well, I want to ask this question as we come to a close here. So, people ask me all the time. I think a lot of people are fascinated by Kierkegaard because they see so much limitless potential in his thinking and in its transformative power. I think that's why so many of us are so devoted to him as a thinker, even though we resist the title of calling ourselves a Kierkegaardian or a disciple or something like that, because he certainly wouldn't have wanted that, in my opinion. But a problem that I have when people ask me, they ask me frequently, what should I read of Kierkegaard's? Right? And it's just like, Jesus Christ, like, where do you begin? Because the problem with, this is such a difficult... I think I'll probably make this a question a part of every Kierkegaardian that I interview. What's so difficult about this question is that Kierkegaard's project all hangs together. There's not like really a standalone text that gives you all of Kierkegaard all at once. It's almost like you're, because of the radical perspectival nature of all the pseudonyms and things like that, everybody's going to be entering it in a different way, and hopefully you get involved enough in the project where you start to read everything and see the whole picture. People always say Fear and Trembling. I feel like that book is so difficult. I would never difficult in the sense to understand. I usually recommend the Philosophical Fragments because I think that the Kierkegaardian doctrine is most rigorously presented there in a span of like 10 or 15 pages. But what do you tell people when they ask you that question? Because I'm sure you get that question a lot too, given that your identity is so bound up in this work.
I can understand why you'd say fragments. I still feel like some of the language is a little obscure.
Yeah.
Same thing. Sickness unto death. You start off with the relation that relates to itself. That whole deal. You start off with Fear and Trembling. You get the whole he beats the breast black and stuff, and you're like, what is happening right now? The first work of Kierkegaard I ever read all the way through was For Self-Examination, Judge for Yourself.
I just read that.
Which were the religious discourse, because it's about the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And so religious discourses are a little bit easier to understand of Kierkegaard's. If you're going to talk about like the authorship proper, I don't know. That's hard. Like I like adequate.
They are more comprehensible. And so when we talk about the religious works of Kierkegaard, I think of like the big ones like Works of Love, Training in Christianity, this Judge for Yourself, for Self-Examination. I don't know. I love Works of Love. I think it's a really beautifully written book. It's one of my favorites. There's a metaphor in there that describes agapeistic love that has resonated with me
apparently
way beyond my first reading.
Apparently there's a Kierkegaard scholar at Copenhagen who once described Works of Love who said, Works of Love, there's no love in this. It's works of, and then he used an expletive to describe it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I won't say which one here.
Yeah, I can deduce. What do you think about it? I think it's beautiful.
I've only read parts of it. I mean, I'm okay with agape, so like,
yeah,
maybe it's just because I'm okay with agape, so.
Yeah, maybe you're a little bit more receptive to it. So, all right. So, where would your endorsement be? Tell the people where they should start. If it were up to you, if you were building a Kierkegaard class, what would be book one?
Book one. You know, I might do. Like if we're talking about the early pseudonyms or the first authorship, the early part of Kierkegaard's work. I might try. I mean, either Or's 1 and 2 are just huge beasts.
They're intimidating.
But I feel like either or 2, especially if you want a moral lesson out of it, because either or 1 is still pretty performative, and you have these multiple aesthetic perspectives. And
what's going on there? Why are we talking about seducing women?
Yeah. So maybe of those, I think either or 2 might be the more easy to comprehend. If we're just talking about comprehensibility, but beyond that. I might do the discourses. Like maybe something like At a Graveside.
Okay.
Or something. Where it's just this discourse about death and how death teaches us, basically, like the psalmist, to count our days. It teaches us that our time is limited and death reminds us to make it count. So maybe At a Graveside, the discourse. Maybe, for self-examination, judge for yourself. If you want some really aesthetic sounding spiritual writing about how the Holy Spirit is basically a death bringer, then
I love it. It's so metal.
I mean, if you're angry at religious people, Attack on Christendom is always great.
Yeah.
Where it's just much more forward and explicit, and he's gotten rid of indirect communication, and now he's like, oh, Jesus said to give up everything for the poor. Well, now our pastors have a pension, so all the poor must be taken care of, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that's the gist of his like. Or I don't know if he actually says that, but
I can see that being popular with certain segments of the population. Fantastic, man.
Yeah.
All right, look, we got to bring this to a close. Longest one yet. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.